Good morning. You might notice that I've changed the title a little from the one that appears in your program. I've not changed the content really or the focus of the talk. Donald and I had a telephone conversation some weeks ago, or maybe a little bit longer ago, about what might be appropriate to focus on for today. And we kind of agreed, I guess, on having 2 points of focus, one on organisations, as we see here, and one on communities. So I've selected just one example of each of those points of focus, which I'll talk about today. And these are very different kinds of aspects of prevention activities in Australia at the moment. And I've been involved with both, but again in really very different kinds of ways. I'm going to start just with some general comments about the prevention framework that Donald introduced a bit earlier. This is the version that I think was originally published in 2008. We don't need to really be too concerned about the kinds of things within the cells here. They're just the original examples that we provided. But I guess with all of these things, from a researcher's point of view particularly, I'm always interested to revise and hopefully improve things along the way. And there are some aspects of this that I've never quite been settled on. But one of the things, I think I've got quite a similar background, I think, to Donald, really. I came to this topic through working as a prison psychologist back in the early 1990s. Spent about 8 years in prison, which is about, I think, longer than most offenders do. And by accident really got involved in treatment programs with sexual offenders, adult sexual offenders. And almost from the beginning it struck me that this was a bit too little too late. There were a whole lot of problems that seemed to present to us at that point, both with offenders and also thinking about what was going on for victims too. It does seem a bit late, doesn't it, just to kind of wait until these things happen and then mobilise a whole lot of resources for it. So I became really interested in this question about prevention right back then. Oops, wrong button. This is the button here. I think one of the problems with this model is this idea of how you might define these levels of prevention. I don't think it's a fatal problem, even in kind of operationalising it for the purposes that Donald was suggesting. And certainly conceptually, I don't think it ought to be a problem. But conceptually, it can be a problem. It certainly is for me. I kind of wrestle with how you might define secondary and primary prevention. I just think that the point is that it's useful to think about simply what is the most sensible thing to do after the fact and what are the kinds of possibilities before the fact. And from a policy point of view, we really should be emphasising the before the fact element of the problem, it seems to me. But we don't. I think it's very clear that almost all of the public policy, all of the public resources are focused on doing something after it's happened. In a way that's understandable because it's simpler in a sense that we know what we're dealing with. Prevention has that problem of how can you ever really tell whether a prevention activity has had a result, because you're looking for a null outcome. You're looking for something to show that hasn't happened as a piece of success. So there are lots of reasons, I guess, why policymakers and others might kind of balk at the real business of prevention. But I think it's a no-brainer, isn't it? There has to be no argument that it's a better option to try and prevent these things from happening in the first place. The other thing that I've not really been comfortable about with this is this element here. It seems to me that abuse, I think everybody's... There is a widespread preoccupation with offenders. That seems to be what drives the media. It seems to be what drives a lot of the political discussion. It seems to be loom large in the minds of the public. The problem really is about offenders. Well, actually it's not. It's about incidents. That's what abuse is. Sometimes these things can take as little as a few minutes. Somebody can be abused in a very short period of time, and it might ever just happen once. So I think the real game, or the real focus, should be on the incidents. And I think that's captured by thinking about these three elements of the framework here. These incidents involve an offender, they involve a victim, and they involve a very specific kind of circumstance in which that occurs. So the introduction or the inclusion of this element here, I'm still not kind of satisfied with. But what it's meant to suggest is the context in which that incident that involves an offender, a victim, and a specific kind of situation occurs. And those contexts give rise to all of the elements of that problem. The context gives rise to the dispositions of offenders, it gives rise to the vulnerabilities of victims, and it gives rise to specific situations in which the offender's disposition interacts with a victim's vulnerability. So there are all sorts of different ways, I think, that we can think about that. I guess I'm just saying I'm not sure that thinking about communities is the right way. There's all sorts of ways we can think about the context. In there, we're thinking about peers, peer relationships of potential victims, for example, and potential offenders, very relevant, family situations, neighbourhood situations, etc. Anyway, that's just some introductory comments that I wanted to make about all of this. So to my two examples. The first one is this idea, this term of child-safe organisations, which has taken on a great deal of significance in Australia quite recently. It's become something of a catchphrase or a touchstone concept, really, driven largely by, we heard this morning about inquiries and commissions. Well, we have one at the moment, a Royal Commission, a National Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse in Australia that was established in early in last year. And when this was starting to be talked about, one of the anxieties that I had about it was that I was hearing a lot of talk about the need for reparation and justice, essentially. This was going to be the purpose of the Commission. And the reason I was anxious about that, not kind of itself would I be anxious about that, because I think that's another no-brainer. Of course, if people are harmed by these things, we should do whatever we can to ameliorate those harms. The problem, as I saw it, was that a commission of inquiry could get stuck with that, to focus its attention on the past, and to lose the opportunity, really, to learn about what's happened in the past in order to improve the circumstances for the future. One of the things I'm learning about media involvement, and one of the things I'm trying to say, I find this such a minefield. So many people have such strong sort of feelings and views about these things that I'm often kind of a little bit terrified of saying anything in public, because I feel like I'm bound to upset somebody or offend somebody. But one of the things I've been trying to say is that the most important people in all of this are the children who haven't been abused yet. That's hard to say because there's victim advocacy groups that are acting on behalf of people who have been victimised, and I'm certainly not suggesting that they need to be kind of left out of the picture. What I'm saying is, if we're going to prioritise things, let's think about the kids who haven't been abused, because that's what prevention is really all about. So I don't think that's necessarily incompatible. I think a commission of inquiry can have a clear focus on the past and justice and reparation, but it's not the same thing as having a focus on prevention. Having the focus on prevention requires really very different kinds of questions to be asked. It requires a different focus and a different kind of analysis. Interestingly, the word prevention doesn't appear in any of the terms of reference for the Commission of Inquiry. That's, I think, how powerful the push has been to kind of direct it toward the justice and reparation for the past agenda. But happily, the commissioners have been wise enough, I think, to have seen for themselves the importance of this piece of work that they're doing and to really take a genuine interest and focus on prevention. So I think the outcome is a good news story, really. But the best that I could find within the so-called, what are they called? The letters patent, I think is the term, direction given by the government to the Commission for its inquiry, that best practice is identified so that it may be followed in the future, both to protect against the occurrence of child sexual abuse and to respond appropriately. Protect against the occurrence, of course, is a phrase that would be familiar from a primary prevention point of view. So I think that's a nice thing at least to see within the other text. The Royal Commission has a range of private hearings where anybody who's been affected by institutional abuse can go and talk to the commissioners themselves and others, and have a whole lot of support services around that. But they're also doing some public hearings in the form of case studies. So the Commission is focusing on specific examples where abuse has been known to have occurred in an institution, and to focus its inquiry on those cases. And I think, very interestingly, has taken the view that they want to, where possible, focus on the most recent cases. Again, from my point of view, that's a good thing, that they're not wanting to just dwell in the past. I guess they're wanting to show that the problem doesn't simply exist in the past, that it exists now, and the work is to be focused on the future. And the other way that they seem to be dealing with this is to focus on examples in their case studies that provide the most informative systemic aspects of the problem, rather than on the most serious cases of victimisation. My own personal observations, I guess I've revealed that already, that the Commission has taken a clear interest in prevention. These are the kinds of questions that need to be asked from a prevention point of view, and I think these are the questions that they're asking. Where does abuse happen? Exactly. When does it happen? How does it happen? Who is involved and why? Simple questions that I think aren't asked often enough about all of this. Again, possibly because of a kind of a preoccupation with the offenders. It's the kind of defective individual concept of the problem. As long as we can kind of keep the bad guys away, that's the problem solved. I think it is shifting the national agenda, and it's certainly challenging this idea that I think institutions have relied on in the past, conveniently. So if abuse happens in an organisation, it's a convenient response to say, well, we really couldn't have done anything about this because these people are so devious and manipulative and cunning that we, what can we do? All we can do is really try and keep those people out. We need to know who they are. There are none of those types of people here, of course, right? They're all different kinds of people, not like me. And I think Commission is shifting this, or it's challenging that idea with this interesting question about, well, hang on, what's happening in the barrel? So organisations themselves, I think, have really bought the popular bad apple stereotype, and therefore, if the concept of the problem is so fundamental to all of this, if we get that wrong, then a whole lot of things kind of follow that aren't very helpful. So getting the conception of the problem right in the first place is the obvious starting point, it seems to me. So if we just kind of focus on the problem as a limited number of deviant individuals, then your prevention efforts focus on two things. Firstly, you keep them out, so we have this big emphasis on employment screening. And secondly, once abuse has occurred, because everybody knows that, well, we won't quite get all of the bad guys out, some of them will infiltrate, our organisations. So if that happens, then we've got to make sure that when abuse comes to light, we have to be scrupulous about our response to that. And what that leaves, of course, is a yawning gap of options for organisations to think about what happens in between those points, what happens while people are within the organisation. I think one of the revelations for the Royal Commission in Australia has been a kind of a recognition of far more limitations to the employment screening concept than they had assumed when they started the Commission of Inquiry. That's not to say that they're suggesting that it ought not to exist, they're just sort of, I think, a little bit surprised by how weak really that system is in and of itself. So the outcome of this, I think, is that there is some nervous anticipation. A lot of child-related organisations in Australia now are kind of reviewing their procedures and policies and so on, because I think that they're imagining that the landscape is about to change and that there'll be new regulatory requirements and possibly, more importantly, legal requirements for organisations or new kind of legal rules about what defines the responsibility of organisations to provide safe places for kids. And the concept of the problem, therefore, begins to change as well, potentially. I think this is very slow in emerging, but I think this is one of the potential outcomes, I think. And there's certainly some discussion going on about this, particularly within organisations themselves. And the Royal Commission, I think, is really pushing this idea that abuse, coming back to the idea that abuse is an incident or a series of incidents, that always involves an interaction of the offender's disposition and an abuse-enabling situation. I think Richard will be speaking a little bit later on this morning, and perhaps will help us. Oh, the lights went out. Maybe help us to think more about what that might mean, the abuse-enabling situation. Because this is a thing, of course, that organisations have within their control. They can't really control the people in the sense of their motivations or dispositions. They can try to not have the bad apples join the organisation, but that's fairly limited, as we've suggested. What they can control is how the organisation itself works while everybody's there. And one way to think about this interaction of the dispositions of abusers and the abuse-enabling situation is to think about variations. This is the problem with the defective individual argument. The bad apple argument is that it's like a categorical class of person, the pedophile. I'm so amused that the English do that term just to kind of give it an extra piece of kind of displeasure. Paedophile. It's like kind of emphasis on the kind of, it's a very unpleasant word, isn't it? But this is not always who the abuser is, actually. And often people are shocked to discover the ordinariness of people sometimes who have sexually abused a child. For many sexual abusers, the most extraordinary thing about them is that they've abused a child. Ask the psychologists. They've been trying for years to find out what's wrong with these people, and they haven't come up with much, really. They look ordinary. Not everybody, obviously. But there's a range of kind of strengths of disposition or types of people that might be involved in abusing a child. There certainly are the group that we're calling here the predatory offenders. But there are also opportunistic offenders that aren't necessarily focused on children as sexual abuse objects, but may well take an opportunity to abuse a child in a specific circumstance that suits them. And then there are offenders that probably would never ever think about it, but in a particular moment, a kind of a coming together of causal factors, they find themselves thinking about this maybe for the first time and acting on it for the first time. And then once that's happened, what do they do? There's not much you can do, really, is there, in the current climate? Who are you going to tell? So it might go on and continue with it. But there are different types of situations as well, and I'm not sure we've got the right terms here, but if we can imagine for an organisation creating the safest possible environment for children, presenting the biggest challenges to a would-be abuser. And I'll just make one more comment on this and move on. So if we can imagine that we have organisations that are the most challenging for abuse to occur, hypothetically what happens here is that you don't have opportunistic offenders at all abusing in that setting, or situational abusers at all. And hypothetically, a third of the abuse opportunities for the predators are also put aside. You're really narrowing the problem by creating a safer organisational setting. By doing nothing to changing people, everything to change the circumstance. Big result, hypothetically, by doing that. Now, the other example, just excuse me. The other example, a very different one, is some work that we've been involved with for a little while that grew out of some clinical work that we've been doing. As I say, I used to work with adult sex offenders in prisons in a kind of a past existence. And when I came to Griffith University in 1998, we had the opportunity fairly early to develop a program for young people who were in trouble in the courts for sex offences. And that made sense to me, kind of in thinking about prevention. Well, that's a little bit a step closer perhaps to an early kind of intervention approach. So we've been doing that for the last 12 or 13 years now. And this prevention project that I'm going to talk about here is really an extension of that. We discovered the problem through the clinical practice. I think there are many ways, different ways, that you might discover particular concentrations of this kind of problem, which is what we're talking about here, our way was through our clinical work, but I'm sure there are many other kinds of ways to discover those things. So going back to an earlier point, that policy and practice continue to be focused on responding after abuse has occurred. Even when problem areas or communities become known through often practitioners' observations, whether you're seeing victims or offenders, and it becomes sort of clear after a while that there's a whole lot of offenders coming out of a particular neighbourhood or a whole lot of victims coming out of a particular neighbourhood. It gives you the kind of sense that there's a particular problem somewhere. But even when these things become known, there typically doesn't seem to me to be any systematic approach to understanding why that is, or to reducing the scope of the problem in that place. More resources may well be allocated to dealing with the flow of identified cases, but it seems not so easy for practitioners and policy people to kind of make the leap to, well, let's really kind of check out why there seems to be a concentration of a problem in this place. The services, especially for offenders, are usually centralised, and often what we do is simply send them back to those places after, let's say, they've done a prison term. One of the places I'm going to be talking about here is a remote Aboriginal community, which has been known for years to be producing a lot of sex offenders. They go to a particular jail, everybody's been talking about it for years. What do? They try and treat them, for heaven's sakes, kind of in a prison, fix them, and then they leave and they go back to their community. Why do you think there would be a high rate of recidivism among those people? Well, because the circumstances they're going back to are highly criminogenic. And whatever you might think, how would you possibly kind of make those people robust to those circumstances? I'm not sure why you would think that would be something that would be reasonable to do. Surely you're better off, if you can, you change the circumstances. So 2 communities of concern were identified by our own clinical service. We call this Griffith Youth Forensic Service. It's a program for youth sexual offenders. These are kids referred to the courts. And I need to tell you a little bit about our practice model, because this is relevant to how it was and why it was that we got involved in the prevention activities that I'm going to describe briefly shortly. So ours is a statewide service. In Queensland, it's a very big place. We see court-referred young people. We provide pre-sentence assessments to the courts, and then we take further referrals and involve ourselves in therapeutic and risk management interventions with those young people. What we're dealing with really is a relatively small, very, very heterogeneous and very geographically dispersed client population. When we first started this program, the funding agency, it was funded through Youth Justice, had assumed that they would fly kids and their families down from wherever they were in Queensland. We had a very nice psychology clinic at Griffith University that they were very impressed with, the government people. So I thought that would be the way to do it. They'll get people in from wherever they are in Queensland, house them somewhere near to our university campus, and kind of get them in taxis or whatever to our clinic. We would give them the appropriate dose of treatment, and then they would return. And we took the fateful decision to say, well, how about we do the travelling? We go to where they are rather than them coming to us. And there's a whole lot of, we think, clinical benefits from having done that. There's a lot of difficulties, of course, because the onus of the travel and the onus of the engagement becomes on the professionals' shoulders, not on the young kids' shoulders. I mean, one benefit, clearly, is that we have virtually no attrition. If you look at other programs that are centralised, about half of the kids who start these programs don't complete them. Why? Because you put the whole responsibility onto them to kind of make the effort to travel and to engage with you and so on. There's been a lot of effort in Australia and in Queensland in particular to keep kids out of detention for a long time. That sort of shifts. There's some resistance against pushes from time to time to get tough and all the rest of it. But there's been a long recognition that once you get kids into detention, it's really hard to get them to extract them out of a justice system after they've done that. So most of our clients are serving community orders, not detention orders. We do provide services in detention centres as well, but a population of, I think, about 3.5 or 4 million in Queensland, we have about 150 kids in detention on any given day. So the number of kids serving detention for sex offences would be maybe 10. Most of these kids are serving community orders. So ours is a field-based model. We send practitioners to wherever the young people are. And in order to do that work, we have to find people who are in those communities on a day-to-day basis to work with us as collaborators around the kind of, making the kids safe, basically, making other people safe from them. We naturally follow the practitioners here in the offender treatment field will recognise the so-called risk needs responsivity model. We prioritise the higher risk offenders, all else being equal. We try and go after the most difficult kids, and we try and match our involvement according to the level of risk and needs. We also prioritise referrals from regional and remote locations, and the logic to this is that quality services are increasingly hard to find the further you move away from major metropolitan areas. So if you're talking about an Aboriginal community of 1,000 people that's hundreds of miles away from the nearest town, there will be no services available that would be appropriate in those places. So we go there and try and build the capacity and work with the families and with the young people themselves. I presume there are offender treatment people here, some. So we target criminogenic needs. So these are factors that we think are related to recidivism, and we try and remove barriers to engagement. We call it the Good Enough Lives model. Hopefully that will amuse at least some people here who might know something of the kind of goings on within the offender rehabilitation area. But that's what we're up to. I won't explain that. And we operate according to an ecological framework whereby we locate the risk and protective factors not just within the individual offender, but also in terms of their relationships with their family, their peers, organisations that they belong to or connect with, the neighbourhood, and I mean we consider the kind of broader environment, but it's really never is a target. So our assessments and interventions then focus on these aspects of what we think are the aspects of the problem: the individual level, situational, family, etc., etc. In practice, usually our assessments lead us to focus on systems that are quite proximal to the kid, namely the family and peer and usually school systems. But occasionally it's become obvious to us that there are wider neighbourhood level problems going on. And this presented us with a clear limit of our clinical capacity. So even though we conceptualise the problem in an ecological framework, even though we operate a field-based model where we go to those communities and spend time there and try and understand the problem behaviour in the context in which it's occurring, it's only in unusual circumstances that we've found that there are these quite serious neighbourhood level contributors to the problem that we can't get to with our clinical service. And this is the point, I guess, of why we thought, well, we really should then extend this work into the business of prevention. We need to do something about what's going on in these neighbourhoods. Having identified those things, it becomes obvious what is the problem, because you've got a whole lot of other kids in those communities that are being exposed to the same risk factors. So they may be offending but not having been caught yet. They may be being victimised but not being identified yet. They may be at a developmental stage where they're soon to be victimised, haven't yet but are about to, or that they're soon to start offending but they haven't yet. And then, of course, you've got a whole lot of generations following behind them that aren't even born yet, that will be the next generation's offenders and victims. That's what you get when you have an ecological niche, if you like, where there are serious risk factors operating that are kind of pushing towards these outcomes for kids and their families. So we've focused on two sites of concern. One is a regional suburban precinct, interestingly enough. I've just been, by the way, the last couple of weeks kind of hounded by tabloid media in Queensland. It's been a nightmare, who've now named these places. I'm not going to name them today because we've given a commitment to the people that we've been working with not to name them, and I'm not going to name them today or give you identifying information. We wrote a report about this to the state government, which we recommended not be published immediately for those reasons, because once you get into the business of naming small communities, you're almost in the business of naming individuals, particularly when you're giving detail. But, you know, our local newspaper, that wasn't good enough for them. Their editor, you know, sanctimoniously declared an editorial that the only way not to hide these problems was to have this, you know, newspaper spotlight on it, you know. So they went into one of the suburbs where we were working and found a local Aboriginal family and found a cage that they could film through. So the front page headline was Human Zoo, with these Aboriginal kids, 3-year-olds, staring out from behind a cage, and then a story about sexual violence in this neighbourhood, you know. This is why we didn't want to publish the report. So that's another problem, actually. We're discovering that everybody seems to think that everybody wants the veil lifted off sexual abuse. I can tell you that a whole lot of people actually don't, because lifting it can be dangerous. Here we've discovered, well, anecdotally at first at least, from our clinical point of view, it seemed pretty clear that we were dealing with serious endemic youth sexual violence and abuse, so revolving mainly around peer-to-peer abuse. We're not talking just underage sex, we're talking about inculcating 8 and 9-year-old kids into peer groups and getting them involved sexually. We're talking about gang rapes, literally, of 12 and 13-year-old girls as part of, you know, the kind of price to pay for peer involvement. All sorts of stuff is going on that's really quite disturbing. In the remote community, this problem tends to extend to the abuse of quite young children, so possibly 4 and 5-year-olds as well, and even younger. In the regional setting, in the other site, it extends in a different direction to the occasional sexual assault of adult female strangers. This particular place, this town, within which this precinct is located, is something of a tourist hub. This is part of the problem that's presented to the government. How do we publicly release a report that kind of talks about danger to young backpackers, you know, who are just wandering, minding their own business late at night, and some kid leaps out from behind a bush and sexually assaults them within an inch of their lives. I mean, these are the kind of things that are going on. You know, girls that are being taken off to hospital with life-threatening injuries after somebody's horrendously attacked them. They're not the kinds of features of the peer-to-peer abuse so much, but it's a very kind of nasty kind of extension, we think, of the problem that's concentrated around the peer-to-peer abuse. So, from an anecdotal clinical point of view, it seemed pretty obvious that we were dealing with some serious hotspots and that we needed to try and do something about it. But we also realised that it was really hard to know what was really going on. This is another problem with sexual abuse and sexual violence more broadly. How do you really find out what's going on? It's a dilemma. Official statistics aren't going to really tell you the story. But anyway, so we set about trying to get some more information, some kind of foothold of evidence to support, you know, kind of what it was that we thought might be useful to do. So a couple of years ago, we were contracted by the state government. This is the report that our newspaper, you know, unceremoniously, it was leaked, you know, by somebody who obviously had some kind of self-righteous agenda. Anyway, so we had a range of official data. We looked at police records over a 10 or 11-year period, youth justice records, health records, as you can see there, births to young mothers, hospital presentations, notifiable STIs, etc. Wouldn't you think that the government department who was charged by the community to look after kids would be the most cooperative in this? Well, they weren't. They gave us nothing. After repeated requests for data, they had all these kind of legal reasons why they couldn't give it to us. And then once that we kind of worked through that, they said, well, actually, we don't count information in this kind of way. We can't tell you how many children were sexually abused at that place. We only collect that data at a regional level, you know. Extraordinary. Extraordinary kind of breakdown of kind of systems, but also an extraordinary anxiety about lifting the veil. These are the people who are supposedly about, you know, kind of lifting the veil. But it's surprising to us how few people really want the veil lifted. We conducted a range of file reviews. We went back to our own clinical files. We could find 17 young offenders from the regional precinct and 6 only from the other. Oh, by the way, that same department told us that the remote community was not a priority for them because they hadn't been a notification of sexual abuse for 5 years. And we said to them, we know why there aren't notifications, and it doesn't mean that it's not happening. Anyway, we nevertheless focused on that place. Family Responsibilities Commission. I don't have time really to explain that, but it's a quite a local, Indigenous-led response in a handful of remote Aboriginal communities that involves local people together with a retired magistrate as the commissioner. They receive notifications for a range of matters within the community and have meetings with the people concerned to try and work through what the problem is and how to find a solution. It's a very local kind of effort to, they get notifications, for example, if kids aren't going to school, or if there's a child protection notification, or a court appearance by one of the adults in the family. So it's focused on families, and it was a gold mine of information. These people had kept meticulous records over a period of about 3 years, and it turns out that we think there were only, this is a population of 1,300 people. We think there were 6 people in that community that did not have a Family Responsibilities Commission file in 3 years. And as I say, meticulous detail. So it was a great source of information for us about what was really going on. We also conducted a range of site observations, which meant going in pairs at various times of the day, various times of the week, just to document who was in various places. We've got some information about where kids were sort of spending time at night and things like this. We conducted 454 of those in one site. In the Aboriginal community, it just wasn't safe enough for us to do that at night time, and it was difficult even in the daytime, so we didn't get quite so many there. But it kind of told us a little bit about the movements of young people, basically, and we were recording how old the kids seemed to be, etc., and what they were up to, drinking or fighting or whatever they were doing. And then a range of interviews, not many. This all happened over a fairly quick period of time, and we didn't have what we thought were very extensive resources, but we're kind of doing our best to try and get a range of data to triangulate, if you like, onto the problem. So I'll just tell you a little bit about what we found from that. Look, I might just go over this. We won't really need to. Yes, so I'll just go to some data. This is the regional precinct. Reported sexual offences within these particular suburbs were 2.2 times the state average, 6 times higher for Indigenous than for non-Indigenous. That's accounting for the proportion of Indigenous people within that community. Finalised youth sexual offences were 5 times higher than for the adjacent areas, so we were starting to think, well, we do have a hotspot here. This isn't something, but when people talk about crime rates for the city, the high rates we're discovering accounted for by actually 10% of the area of the city. Stranger victim offending was 4 times higher, which was a bit of a revelation to us, just looking at our own clinical cases, and 3 times higher in public settings. So you can understand, I guess, we know that most sexual abuse happens in domestic settings. When you talk about kids as offenders, actually, they're more likely than adult offenders to be offending in public settings. Why is that? Probably because they don't have the same kind of control over a domestic space as adults do. So kids occupy public spaces often, particularly when they're disengaged from school, disengaged from homes. They'll take over places in parks and so on. And this is where these offences were going on as well. They're also more severe, just looking at the kind of level of violence and whether weapons were used. 40% of the victims were Indigenous women and children, although it was really clear that this is very much a tip of the iceberg. Indigenous people are much less likely to report these things as well. So it's surprising in a way that showed up in the official data. Notifiable STI rates were 3.3 times the state average, and especially an elevation of gonorrhoea and syphilis. And without going into too much of the detail, this work kind of led us to quite some detail, but still not enough, of where the unsafe areas were for kids, where the youth activity hotspots were, etc. We know quite a lot about what's going on in terms of school engagement, gangs, etc., etc., etc. So quickly to the second site. Here it's worse. So we've got, this is the Aboriginal community, 6.6 times the state average of recorded sexual offences. This is a place where almost nobody ever tells anybody anything, and yet even in those circumstances we're seeing this kind of extraordinary elevation of official offending. All of the offenders were Indigenous. A lot of them were under 17, which is interesting. It's twice the state average, relatively, of young offenders. We'll have a look at that. This is one of those shocking things for us. The notifiable STI rates in this community were 56 times the state average. And over a 12-year period, there were 230 individual cases of STIs for children under 16. There were also high levels of births to mums under 16 as well. I've got about 5 still minutes. 8. There we go. So 15 mothers had given birth prior to the age of 16. All right. So where has this led us? Actually, it's led us to thinking we still don't really know what's going on. we still don't think we've got the kind of detail that we would really like to be really clear about what we might do. But we've got a team together. We've got some funding now from the Australian government, from the Prime Minister's Department actually, including some people who are here. We've got Donald involved, Richard's here, as well as Richard's colleague Nick Tilley from UCL, and a group of people from Griffith as well. And we've got a range of partnerships. This is the way we're trying to do business. It's all about partnerships, and that's a job in itself, managing that. Sorry, I'll get to this. So we've adopted what we're calling, or what is called, a realist model. This is a systematic, theory-driven, but also data-driven or evidence-informed method. We're wanting to measure pretty much anything we can, knowing that no single measure is going to be to kind of nail it. And because you can't find a single source or even a kind of a small number of sources that will really tell us what is going on, we need multiple sources, because the errors are different across different sources. So if multiple sources of data are pointing in the same direction, then our confidence is increasing that that's what the picture is. So this model, the realist model, asks what works for whom, in what contexts, and how. So the point of what we're doing here is, I guess you'd call it a proof of concept project. We're not thinking that we're going to, eliminate sexual abuse in either of these places. What we are wanting to do is small things, numerous small things, attacking various aspects of the problem, but in a careful way, in a very measured way, so that we'll be able to say this seems to work for these kinds of aspects of the problem in this kind of context. And because context is vital, it raises a whole lot of interesting questions about transferability. And ultimately, we want this to be transferable. But what we're trying to achieve is a prevention model, which is essentially a method that we can transfer to other places. But within that method will be a range of individual interventions that may well themselves not be transferable, if that makes sense, because they make sense in this context, but they might not in that context. So the method will involve some analysis from place to place, really. It's not a program, I like to say. You go to Aboriginal communities, the first thing you'll be asked is, well, what's your program? And our delight is, we don't have a program. We're just here to figure out what's going on. We'd like to know what's happening. So it's about context, it's about mechanism. So we're trying theoretically to specify why would we expect this thing to work. So it's kind of like a project logic model. And what are the outcomes that we expect to see? And just as important, what are the potential negative outcomes that could be produced if we do this? And how can we monitor that? So it's a process or a procedure that involves continuous monitoring. So it's a matter of establishing baseline measures from multiple sources, continuing to measure from those sources so as to monitor changes in positive or negative directions. It's a very flexible approach, which means that if you're encountering if you're not succeeding, or worse, if you discover that you're actually making things worse for some kids, then you can stop doing that and kind of regroup and move in a different direction. The interventions themselves are based on established crime prevention concepts, but also the flexibility of the model allows a lot of innovation. So we're not trying to repeat anything that's been done anywhere else, except for the kind of method. That's what we're trying to repeat, not the interventions. So we've established local implementation groups. This is important and difficult as well, finding people in local communities that want to work with us to advise us about what are the resources in this community, who are the people that we need to know and who can do what, and does this make sense here? And what are your ideas? What do you think ought to be done? So we have conversations and try and kind of work through a plan for each site. And okay, so it's about prioritising problems and interventions according to likely impact and practicalities. No point in trying to do something grand that obviously won't work or that it's impractical. Better to do something small that will. And then you can do multiple small things. And to develop locally tailored prevention plans for both of these sites, we've contracted with the funding agency to trial a minimum of 5 to 6 intervention activities for each site. We suspect there'll be more than that. Part of the kind of importance of the context as well is recognising that when you're dealing with complex social problems, it's a movable feast. You've got things going on all over the place. And often in problem communities, there's a whole lot of government agencies as well that are active trying to do things as well. So you're not dealing with a blank slate, you're dealing with a complex, moving kind of environment that you need to kind of anticipate and work within. So quickly then, just to finish with the challenges, these are really very hidden problems. This is the first problem that we face from an evidence-informed or evidence-based practice point of view. It's really hard to get the evidence. Finding hotspots. I mean, we're sure that we've found the hotspots. We think that we've done a reasonable job at prioritising the targets because these are multifaceted problems. Official data provide useful indications, I mentioned that, but they don't really tell you the real story. And the realist method seeks and utilises multiple data sources. I think engaging with local people is absolutely critical. I mean, I know a lot of people would say that, but I think it's rarely done, actually, in an authentic way. I come back to this point, exposing the problems, the exposure itself can be problematic. How do you work through that? How do you work through not causing more harm in your effort to solve it? And in our case, particularly because we're working with Indigenous people, these people are already tragically overrepresented in criminal and youth justice systems and in child protection systems. Their big fear is that this will result in more kids being taken away and more men and young men being arrested, which is, we're at great pains to explain that that's not what we're wanting to do. There are also interesting and complex problems in terms of interethnic and interclan and peer group reprisals that can occur when people start to talk about these kinds of things. I think it's amazing to me that governments tend to be inclined just to do more of what hasn't worked. And this is all really why, coming back to the prevention model, why primary and secondary prevention is so important. Why would you, for these communities, bring to them some kind of solution that's about getting more convictions and more child safety notifications? In fact, you want fewer of those things on the basis that the problem isn't happening, not because you're hiding it even more and dealing with it. Oh my God. Really, there are so many forces at work to militate against useful solutions. It's extraordinary. For all the people who are, kind of wanting to be on the bandwagon to fly the flag. Okay, so that will do. Thank you.